Hey, good morning. It is April 8th, and we're going to examine the Unit 1 passage FRQ for English 4, namely Hitting Trees with Sticks by Jane Rogers. So, let's start with the prompt first. If you want to read the prompt, go ahead and hit pause now. Otherwise, we are moving on. And if you notice, I color coded the prompt so that you can see the difference between background, advice, and task. To bat the prompt is a really good strategy to use, especially if you're unclear on what they're asking you to do. There's almost always going to be background on the piece, advice, and then the actual task that they're asking you to do and that you will be scored on. So the prompt's task is twofold, as most passage analysis prompts will be. As you can see, it's asking you how the passage uses first-person point of view to express Celia's complex perspective. Now the prompt is helpful. It gives you the literary element that it wants you to focus on, and that is first-person point of view. But your answer to the passage analysis, if this were a full essay, you have to completely answer and address not only the use of first person point of view, but how it is expressing a complex perspective. So, how do we do that? Well, there are, of course, as with anything in English, for multiple ways to do so, but I find it helpful to work backwards in the same way that we do with theme, is that we start with a complex theme statement. If the piece is asking you to identify a theme, you start with that complex theme statement and then you work backward. You go into, okay, how is the author using literary elements, figurative language, any sort of tool they have in their toolbox to communicate that theme? How did you arrive at that theme? What did the author do that made you identify a theme statement? So we work backwards. We start by what makes Celia's perspective complex. So once you arrive at that answer, ask, okay, well, how does point of view shape that complexity? So, what makes her perspective complex? Well, she's clearly characterized as observant and intelligent based on the details of the passage, and yet there are gaps in her memory. There are moments that contradict what she thinks is going on or what she thinks has happened. There's also a contrast between her experience of the world and what's actually going on. The author is using inference, inferring and implying that certain things have happened without her knowledge. And so this is just, again, the author using detail. You could say that the author is using setting, the events that are going on around the character, and the dialogue between her and other people. And also, what points to the contrast is, as I said earlier, she's observant and intelligent as characterized by her use of language and the details that she chooses to note. And especially one that stood out to me was that she, even at her age, she could remember the Latin name of this particular tree. And so she's seemingly intelligent, at least in the area as far as trees are concerned, and in the area of the way that she expresses herself through language. Um, and so to look at how that makes her complex, well, in literature, what is complex is simply that which is not straightforward. And as I said a moment ago, contrast creates the complexity. What is that? Okay, so then what does that have to do with first person point of view? Well, everything. We see the world as she sees it. We experience the world as she does. Only we as readers are able to see the gaps and infer that she is experiencing some form of dementia, Alzheimer's, or possibly age-related mental deficiency. So first person point of view lets us in. It brings us into the mind of someone that is going through a very obvious mental decline. So if we were to create a prompt out of this, that first person point of view lets us experience the mental decline of someone who is observant but is also experiencing gaps in her memory. If we were to create a thesis out of that, we have to make a claim statement that is defensible. And as I saw in some of the passage analyses, some people were just restating the prompt, and we have to get away from that because to just restate the prompt, restate what the question's asking, you're not creating anything that is defensible. So if you were to say that Rogers uses first person point of view to express Celia's complex perspective, we know that the author does that. That's in the question. They're not asking you, does she? They're not saying yes or no, is she using first person point of view? They're saying how. How is she doing that? And so addressing the how is when the defensible nature of the thesis comes in, because there's no argument you can make against that. Yeah, I read the piece. I know that she uses first person point of view. And yes, there is a complex perspective. So with an AP literature prompt, it's always going to answer how. And then if you want, take a step further and go into why. In that note, when writing a passage analysis, much like a rhetorical analysis, you have to answer what, how, and why. So I created a thesis, statements, two statements. A thesis doesn't just have to be one sentence. I created a thesis I think that's workable. So, and as you can see, I color coded it for the what, the how, and the why. So through first person perspective, Rogers brings the reader into the mind of Celia, an observant, intelligent woman whose memory is failing her. The contrast between her observant nature and the clear gaps in her memory produce an unsettling effect, highlighting the idea that those who have the most, in Celia's case her intellect, have the most to lose. I'll admit it's not the best, but it is workable. It answers what, how, and why. And I think for a passage analysis, just doing the what and the how works. Going a step further and getting into the why, if there's room to do it, that's up to you. The passage doesn't explicitly ask for getting into a why, getting into these thematic tones and these thematic ideas, but if there's room for it, and if it happens naturally as you write, I say go for it. That's what literary analysis is. It's going the step further. It's not just talking about the what and the how, but diving into the why. So let's pretend that this is a prompt for a full essay. Prompts like this can be difficult to recommend a format since there are multiple ways to approach it. And I do have to say, when you've been writing, if you're consistently scoring in the high levels, you clearly have something that works for you. I'm going to continue to make comments on the AP websites, practice FRQs, and things like that. But before we move forward, I don't want to pigeonhole you into a set format to where you say, okay, I have to do it this way or it's wrong. So like I said, there's multiple ways to approach it. One way that you can approach it is to find two elements that make the narrator's perspective complex. Is it the contrast between her intelligence and what's going on? Is it the use of dialogue? Is it the use of detail? Really, any of those work. You pick two of those things, and then you format a paragraph around each, and then you dedicate the third support paragraph to connecting both of those elements to first person point of view. So you've addressed the complexity and you've addressed how point of view communicates that complexity, how the author uses point of view to communicate complexity. And then you could go a step further and talk about the effect that it produces on the reader. Another, of course, is to use the what, how, and why approach. One paragraph addresses what is going on. I know I say that the road to hell is paved with summary, and that's only if your whole essay is summary. You're just summarizing what happened. You're not going into the how and the why. So your first paragraph talks about what is going on. You use summary sparingly, but you read between the lines. Case in point, you note the narrator's loss of memory through paraphrasing. You note the gaps. You mention that she's intelligent, you mention that she's observant, but then you also note that there are some problematic areas where what is happening and what she thinks is happening don't line up. And then you can get into the how, which would be the next paragraph. The next paragraph would discuss how the author uses literary elements, in this case, first person perspective, as evidenced through dialogue and detail, to communicate the loss of memory. So, how are we as readers brought into her experience of it? Through first person perspective. Um, and I would think the obvious would be, well, if you're using third person perspective, specifically third person omniscient, they would just come out and tell you, okay, well, she's got dementia. Simple as that. But with first person perspective, we're in her mind and she doesn't know that she has it. And then the final support paragraph would address the why the author is using first person perspective to communicate the loss of memory. This is a great place for analyzing a thematic idea if you choose to do so. Again, if there's room to do so. I don't think any author writes a piece without there being a why. And so, as long as you've addressed that there's a complex perspective and the author has used first person point of view to effectively communicate that complex perspective, you can dive into the why. I would say to rely on your own instincts in that regard. You guys have been writing for a while, and so if you notice a good spot for that, you can dedicate that final support paragraph getting into the why, as long as you keep tying it back to the use of first-person perspective. First-person point of view, and the complex perspective that Celia has. And even though the prompt doesn't necessarily ask for a theme, it certainly falls under the how the author uses first-person perspective umbrella. Just don't focus your entire essay on the theme unless you're asked to do so. And a few things that are worth noting, essentially what I just said, even though the prompt doesn't ask for a theme, addressing a theme falls under that umbrella. And discussing the effect it produces on the reader is very much part of analysis, and it's going to show evidence of deeper thinking. There were plenty of times where I've either scored essays or when I was looking at essays when we were at AP Summer Institute, the people who were teaching it were saying, if you see evidence of deeper thinking, you really, and they've answered the prompt, they've done the task, but they're diving in, that's going to boost their score. You give them points for what they do right, not what they do wrong. And so when I've looked at essays last year and some this year, whenever I've seen evidence of deeper thinking going on, even if it's not explicitly answering the prompt has been answered, they've made their case, they've had evidence, they've had commentary, and then they dedicate a piece to kind of start to break it apart further. That's the mark for a high score in my book. And so showing evidence of deeper thinking can only help you in the end. Next up, as long as the questions of what, how, and why are answered and supported with evidence and commentary, then it works. So just keep that in mind. Have I answered the what? Have I answered the how? Have I answered the why? Have I supported them well? Okay, cool. Then you've done a literary analysis. Next up, literary tools aren't just limited to things like symbolism, imagery, and juxtaposition. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about these wonderful terms, things like allusions, ambiguity, and getting into the complexity of a text. Keep in mind that simple things like character dialogue, detail, word choice are valid elements to use as evidence to support your claim. All right, remember to include 2 to 3 pieces of commentary for every piece of evidence that you have. You want to be thorough in connecting your evidence back to your claims, and don't assume the reader will connect the dots for you. If you say that the presence of a raven shows us that foreshadows that something bad's going to happen. Okay, you're missing a link in that chain. Why is it foreshadowing that? You can't just take for granted that your reader may know that, oh, well, yeah, a raven is a common symbol of, of death approaching or something like that. You have to make that connection for your reader. The writer needs to be doing the work. So if you say that the presence of the raven foreshadows that something bad will happen, primarily because ravens are often symbols for death in other stories, okay, there we go. You connected those dots. Don't assume that the reader has the same knowledge that you do. Remember that when you write for the AP exam, and really for any academic literary paper, your audience is always going to be the academic skeptic, someone who's intelligent, but they're skeptical of the claims that you are making. And then finally, I'll put this in here in case of emergency, break glass and use this format for your supporting paragraphs. Again, those of you who are skilled writers, I say trust your instincts. You know what good writing looks like. But if you hit a wall and you don't quite know how to write a good support paragraph for a prompt you've been given, I would write this on a sheet of paper and have it out when just whenever you do these things. And that is, first off, the main claim of the paragraph, the claim that you're making, 1 to 2 sentences that point back to the thesis, evidence, paraphrased or quoted, and then 2 to 3 sentences of commentary. And then, if the main claim of the paragraph, you feel that it needs more evidence and commentary, just repeat steps 2 and 3, and then move on. And so that's all I have for this one. I'll be creating another presentation that addresses the second question of the Unit 1 FRQ soon.